In 1751, on a sugar estate in Jamaica, there was an axe kept beside the mill, not for the cane. Cane was cut in the field with a machete. The axe hung by the rollers, and it was there for a different job. In crop season, the mill never stopped because cut cane starts to spoil within a day, so the rollers turned through the night, and someone had to keep feeding them. That someone was usually a woman or a boy working 18 hours, half asleep on their feet. And every so often, a hand went in with the cane. The rollers had no break. Whoever was standing nearest had a few seconds to make a decision, take the arm off at the elbow, or watch the machine take the whole person. The axe was ordered along with the copper kettles. It appears in estate inventories as its own line item between the ladles and the shovels. This was not one cruel overseer. This was procedure. The same axe hung in Barbados, in Saint-Domingue, in Brazil, in Cuba. Everywhere the same mill turned out the same product. Notice what that means. Not a weapon, not an instrument of punishment, a tool. Standard equipment for manufacturing the thing that is sitting in your kitchen right now in a paper bag, and that a cafe will hand you for free in little packets, which half the time you don't even bother to take. By the 1780s, a single island, French Saint-Domingue, smaller than Wales, was producing something like 40% of the world's sugar and earning France more than all 13 British colonies in North America put together. And a person shipped there from Africa was not, on average, expected to survive 10 years. Sugar was never really food. Sugar was an economy, an army, a body of law, and a death sentence, all in the same white crystal. It moved more human beings across the Atlantic than gold, silver, and spices combined. So how did a grass do that? And what did we all agree to forget once it got cheap? But this story doesn't begin in the Caribbean, and it doesn't begin with an axe by a mill. It begins about 8,000 years earlier and half a world away, on an island in the Pacific, where a tall, coarse grass grew along the swamps. No empires, no ships, no plantations. Just somebody who snapped a stalk, tasted what ran out of it, and found a flavor that barely existed anywhere else in nature. To understand why people later killed for sugar, you have to understand why sweetness has this grip on us in the first place. For the human body, a sweet taste isn't a pleasure signal. It's a safety signal. Almost nothing in nature is sweet and poisonous at the same time. Bitterness is a warning. Sourness is a caution. But sweetness means energy you can use immediately. Your brain runs on glucose and burns 1/5 of your entire energy budget. For an animal that spent millions of years living one bad season away from starvation, sweetness was the only honest promise in the landscape. Fuel. Here. Now. Eat it while it exists. And it almost never existed. Ripe fruit for a few weeks a year. Honey once a season, with smoke and stings and risk. Everything else was starch, fiber, and meat. Human beings lived for tens of thousands of years, tasting real sweetness a handful of times annually, and our biology was shaped by exactly that scarcity, which is why we have no satiety mechanism for it. You have one for fat, you have one for protein. There is no break fitted for sugar, because in the whole span of our evolution, no situation ever arose in which one would have been useful. Now imagine someone works out how to turn that rarity into a dry white powder that doesn't rot, that can be weighed, packed into a barrel, shipped across an ocean, and sold a year later exactly as it was. Sugar became the first substance in history to combine two properties. It triggers almost unconditional desire, and it keeps forever. Salt kept forever, but nobody craved it. Spices were craved, but they didn't feed anyone. Sugar did both. From that moment, it stops being food and becomes what anything becomes when everybody wants it and almost nobody can make it. It becomes currency, and people fight over currency. It starts around 8,000 years ago in New Guinea. Saccharum officinarum, a thick grass 3 or 4 meters tall, its stalk 2/3 sweet juice. Nobody sowed it. You planted a cut piece of stem, like a potato, and it grew back. People chewed the raw cane, crushing the juice out with their teeth. It appeared in ritual as an offering, and in myth as the material the first humans were made from. There was no industry, because there could not be. You couldn't store the stuff. You could only chew it where it stood. From there, in the canoes of Austronesian sailors, came travels. To the Philippines, into Indonesia, along the coasts of Indochina, and by roughly the first millennium BCE, it reaches India, where somebody finally does the thing nobody had thought of for 7,000 years. They stop chewing it. They learn how to boil it down into a solid. The real revolution happens in the Ganges Plain. Cane juice is boiled in shallow pans until it thickens into a dark, granular mass, what India still calls gur, or jaggery. Then comes repeated washing and draining, separating the molasses, and out the other end comes something that does not occur in nature anywhere. Sweetness, detached from the plant. The Sanskrit word for those grains is sharkara, and it means gravel, grit, little stones. Hold on to that word, because it becomes Persian shakar, Arabic sukar, Italian zucchero, French sucre, German zucker, and English sugar. For 1,000 years, Europe called this substance by a word that simply means sand. By the Gupta era, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Indian craftsmen are producing proper crystals, hard, translucent, the size of pebbles. That lump has a name too, Khanda. It travels west through Persian khand and Arabic trade, and arrives in English as candy. So sugar and candy are both Indian words, one for the sand, one for the rock. The first European on record to notice any of this was Nearchus, an admiral of Alexander the Great. In 326 BCE, his fleet worked its way along the Indian coast, and his report contained a line that got copied for centuries. In India, there is a reed that produces honey without any bees. To a Greek, this was close to a miracle. Honey meant hives, swarms, seasons, danger. Here, honey grew out of the ground. Alexander would be dead in 3 years, and his empire in pieces. But that sentence survived. So the very first thing the West learned about sugar was not a recipe. It was envy. From India, the sweet stone moves west into Persia. Sasanian rulers bring cane into Mesopotamia and the valleys near the Gulf, and at Jundishapur, a city famous for its medical school and hospital, the refining is perfected. It is the Persians who finished the trick that turned sugar into a long-distance commodity. Hot syrup is poured into clay cones with a hole at the bottom. The molasses drains away, and what stays behind is a dense white loaf, a cone of crystals. That loaf can travel for a year, 3 years. It doesn't weep, ferment, or spoil. You chip pieces off it and sell them by weight. And here sugar acquires a second profession that will feed it for almost 1,000 years. It becomes medicine. Persian and then Arabic medicine is built on the balance of humors in the body. And in that system, sugar is warm, moist, softening, restorative. It treats coughs. It carries bitter drugs. It becomes syrup, Arabic sharab, gives us both syrup and, through a cousin word, sherbet and sorbet. Physicians prescribe it by the drachm. Apothecaries keep it locked up next to rare resins and opium. Sit with how completely that inverts the modern picture. For the first millennium of its written history, the substance you know as bad for you was an expensive pharmaceutical prescribed to the sick, and it is as medicine, not as food, that it first reaches Europe. Next, sugar does what few crops manage. It follows an army across a map. From the 7th and 8th centuries, as the Arab Caliphate expands, cane spreads across the whole southern Mediterranean, Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, Sicily, North Africa, Muslim Spain. And this isn't just seeds moving. It's an entire technology package: irrigation canals, water lifting wheels, crop rotation, and the knowledge of boiling and refining. Cane is a greedy plant. It wants heat and enormous amounts of water, and in the dry Mediterranean it could only exist where engineers knew how to move a river. Egypt becomes the center of the trade. Its sugar is reckoned the finest anywhere, and its whiteness is a point of national pride. And here sugar becomes something new again, neither food nor medicine, but spectacle. At the court of the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo, festival tables carried sculptures made of sugar, life-size trees, animals, entire model palaces, broken up and handed out when the feast ended. A single celebration could consume tens of tons. This was a pure display of power. Look, we can waste on table decoration the substance European doctors sell by the pinch. And here you can already see the machinery that will repeat itself for the next 800 years. Sugar always moves in the same 3 steps. First, it arrives as a rarity for the powerful. Then land and water are rebuilt to produce it. Then people are rebuilt to produce it. The Egyptian and Levantine estates already ran on more than free peasant labor. They used gang labor, seasonal conscripts, and slaves. The model wasn't lethal yet, but the model was built. In 1099, Europeans put their hands on it. Crusaders who had taken Jerusalem and the coast of the Levant found fixed stands of an unfamiliar grass in the valleys near Tripoli and Tyre. A chronicler describes starving soldiers cutting the stalks and sucking the juice to keep going. Not a hive, not an orchard, a field that ran with sweetness. But what happened next matters more than the discovery. The Crusaders did not become customers. They took over production. The land around Tyre, Acre, and Tripoli turned into European sugar estates, complete with the canals, mills, and kettles already in place. The work was done by dependent local peasants, by captives, and by slaves bought in Mediterranean markets. The management came from the military orders and from Italian merchants, Venetians and Genoese above all, who took charge of shipping it out. And so, in the 12th century Levant, The whole structure assembles for the first time. A single crop on conquered land, coerced labor, imported technology, metropolitan capital, a finished product that goes entirely to export, and no local market at all. It isn't yet a plantation in the later sense, but it is the blueprint. 300 years later, that blueprint will be pulled out again on islands in an ocean the Crusaders didn't know existed. And in the meantime, sugar starts flowing into Europe. It flows through Venice. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Venetians control most of Europe's sugar trade. Raw sugar from Cyprus and Egypt comes in. Refineries in the city clean it up, and what goes out are those white cones, sugar loaves, wrapped in blue paper. Blue not for decoration. Against blue paper, a slightly yellow crystal reads as whiter than it is. The first packaging trick in commercial history, invented for sugar. In Europe, the price is spice level, which is to say, absurd. It's sold on apothecary scales, by the ounce. It appears in wills. A sugar loaf is a standard diplomatic gift to kings, alongside silks and silver. And at noble feasts, it is sculpted into edible castles and coats of arms, set out between courses so guests can see what the host can afford. And it is still, simultaneously, in the pharmacy. There was a proverb about an apothecary with no sugar, the phrase for a man missing the basic tool of his trade. Sugar-coated pills, disguised bitter drafts, treated weakness. A physician could prescribe it to someone who could never have bought it. Here's the English marker for how that changed. When a German visitor was presented to Queen Elizabeth I in 1598, he wrote down, among the jewels and the dresses, one physical detail. Her teeth were black. He put it down to the English habit of eating too much sugar. That was the top of society at the end of the 16th century, sweet enough to ruin a queen's mouth and unreachable for everyone else. 250 years later, the same substance would be the cheapest source of calories available to a mill worker in Manchester. Everything between those two facts is the rest of this film. For sugar to get cheap, somebody had to produce it on a scale the Mediterranean could never manage. And the Mediterranean was at its ceiling. Cold winters, not enough water, not enough land. Then the Portuguese sailed into the Atlantic and found the answer. Madeira. An uninhabited island 400 miles off the Moroccan coast, covered in forest. The name means timber. The Portuguese began clearing it in the 1420s. They burned the slopes, cut irrigation channels called levadas across the mountains, and plant cane. The climate is perfect. The water is there. The soil has never been farmed. By the end of the 15th century, this speck of land is putting more sugar into Europe than the entire Levant, and for the first time in history, the price of sugar falls. But look at the mechanism underneath the miracle. Cane devours labor, cut by hand, delivered within hours, milled and boiled around the clock. On an empty island, there are no workers, and very few people volunteer for that job. So the Portuguese do what they already know how to do. They bring people in from elsewhere, first Canary Islanders, then captives from West Africa. Sugar and slavery did not meet on Madeira for the first time, but on Madeira they fused. Sugar turned out to be a crop that barely tolerates a smallholder. Mills and kettles are expensive and only pay at volume. Volume needs land. Land needs a great many hands in one short season, and that means labor which cannot leave and cannot name its price. The economics of the sweetest thing on earth pushed it, almost mathematically, toward slavery. And the next island showed what that looked like, with nothing softening it at all. Sao Tome is a small volcanic island sitting almost exactly on the equator in the Gulf of Guinea, about 150 miles off the African coast. The Portuguese find it empty in the 1470s. For a European, the climate is close to lethal. Heat, humidity, malaria. For Cain, it is paradise. And more importantly, the slave markets of the mainland are a few days away rather than a few weeks. And on Sao Tome, the whole machine finally assembles. Not an estate that happens to use slaves. An island whose entire economy is one crop, whose entire workforce is purchased people, and whose entire output crosses an ocean. No town worth the name, no crafts, no domestic market, no reason to exist, except white crystals in barrels. By the middle of the 16th century, Sao Tome is the largest sugar producer in the world, and thousands of people are landed there every year. They are landed because they die faster than they are born. The work, the disease, the diet. The plantation does not reproduce its population, it consumes it. The only way to make up the shortfall is to buy more. Think about what that does to a ledger. A human being becomes not a worker, but a consumable with a known service life, like a kettle or a mill roller. And that is literally how the books were kept. It is also on Sao Tome that enslaved people staged the first major revolts and found free settlements in the mountains, setting up the second half of a plot that will repeat on every sugar island for 300 years. By the time the Portuguese had this model working, the Spanish already had charts of a new ocean, and the system perfected on a scrap of land near Africa went across the Atlantic together with the cuttings. Christopher Columbus carried them himself. On his second voyage in 1493, he took cane shoots from the Canary Islands and planted them on Hispaniola, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The first attempts go badly. No skilled boilers, no mills, no capital. But by the 1510s, the first real mills are turning, and in the 1520s, the Spanish crown is actively subsidizing sugar works with loans. The problem, again, is hands. The indigenous population of the Caribbean islands, the Taino, collapses within decades under imported disease, forced labor, and famine. Islands that held hundreds of thousands of people are effectively empty by the middle of the 16th century. So the Spanish do what the Portuguese did and ship people from Africa. The first large consignments of enslaved Africans to Hispaniola arrived for sugar work before the silver mines of the mainland were even running. And there's a coincidence here that isn't one. The cane takes to the New World as though it had been waiting. Heat, rain, volcanic soil. What in Spain demanded canals and a fight over every liter of water simply grows. Nature appeared to hand Europe an infinite fortune on one condition. Somebody has to cut it and boil it. The Spanish, as it happens, got distracted. Cortés took Mexico in the 1520s, Pizarro took Peru in the 1530s, and silver started to flow. Why bother with grass when a mine gives you metal? So the sugar relay passed to those who had no silver, to the Portuguese, and to their vast, nearly empty colony in the south. Brazil becomes a sugar power within a single century. By the 1570s, the coasts of Pernambuco and Bahia carried dozens of engenhos, a word that means not simply mill, but the whole complex: fields, mill, boiling house, warehouses, chapel, the master's house, and the workers' quarters. The word literally means engine or contrivance, and that is an accurate description. The Ingenio is the first factory in history, arriving 2 centuries before the Industrial Revolution, division of labor, shifts, a continuous production cycle, and brutal discipline. By the early 1600s, Brazil is the largest sugar producer on earth, and that entire output rests on the labor of Africans shipped across the Atlantic by the tens of thousands. Brazilian sugar fills Lisbon, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, and it is Dutch merchants who finance, insure, and resell most of it. Then the Dutch decide that being the middleman isn't enough. In 1630, the Dutch West India Company seizes Pernambuco and holds the northeast of Brazil for nearly a quarter of a century. The Portuguese win the territory back by 1654, and the Dutch have to leave. But they don't leave empty-handed. They leave with the knowledge, how to build the mill, how to size the kettles, how to run the boiling, how to organize a plantation, where to buy people, how to insure a voyage, where to raise credit. This is the most underrated moment in the whole story. The land was recaptured and the technology walked out of the door. The Dutch spread it around the Caribbean to English and French colonists sitting on small, unpromising islands planted with tobacco. One of those is about to become the most valuable real estate on the planet. Barbados is the easternmost of the Lesser Antilles, about the size of the Isle of Wight. The English settle it from 1627 and spend nearly 20 years growing tobacco. Poor tobacco, cheap, losing every comparison with Virginia. The colony is considered a failure. In the early 1640s, sugar cane arrives with Dutch capital and Dutch expertise, and within a single decade, the island turns inside out. Planters buy up small holdings and consolidate them into large estates. Indentured white servants, shipped over on fixed-term contracts, turn out to be a bad investment. A contract has an end date, after which the man is free and wants land of his own. An enslaved African has no end date, and under the new laws, neither do his children. By the 1660s, black people outnumber white people on Barbados, and land prices have multiplied several times over. On historians' estimates, by the late 1660s, the exports of this one small island were worth more than the exports of every other English colony in the Americas combined. 160 square miles of coral rock was worth more than the future United States. And here, a document appears that is worth slowing down for. In 1661, the Barbados Assembly passes a comprehensive law on the status of enslaved people. It codifies things that did not previously exist in English law at all. A lifelong inheritable status attached to descent, sweeping rights of punishment for the owner, and effectively no protection for the person. That code is then copied in places almost word for word by Jamaica, Antigua, and South Carolina. The legal foundation of slavery in the English-speaking world was not drafted in Virginia and not in London. It was drafted on a sugar island for a sugar economy, because that economy needed a guarantee that its workforce could never walk away. One example of how close all this still is. Drax Hall on Barbados was one of the island's first sugar estates, established in the 1640s by an English planting family. The house they built is still standing. It still belongs to descendants of the same family. Between that story and this morning, there is not a gulf. There is a single unbroken line of ownership, 4 centuries long. Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Cuba. Across the 17th and 18th centuries, the Caribbean becomes one continuous, open-air sugar factory. And that factory can only run on one condition. a constant delivery of people. What forms around it is the system later called the triangular trade. A ship leaves Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, or Bordeaux loaded with goods, textiles, ironware, pots, guns, spirits. On the West African coast, that cargo is exchanged for human beings, with local rulers and trading intermediaries for whom the slave trade also becomes a business. The second leg is the Atlantic crossing, the Middle Passage. 6 weeks to 3 months in a hold where a person lies on their side in a space smaller than a coffin. Part of the cargo does not reach the far shore. In the Caribbean, the people are sold. The hold is refilled with sugar, molasses, and rum, and the ship goes home to sell all of it again. There was one more component in this machine, and it usually gets forgotten. Boiling sugar leaves molasses behind, a thick, dark byproduct that was at first simply thrown away, until somebody thought of distilling it. That gave the world rum, cheap, strong spirit made, quite literally, out of sugar's waste. It went to sailors, it went to plantations as part of the ration, and it went back to Africa, where it became one of the principal goods used to buy people. The circle closed. The waste from sugar purchased the hands for sugar. In New England, dozens of distilleries grew up on Caribbean molasses, and when London tried to tax that flow, first with the Molasses Act, then with the Sugar Act of 1764, the colonists took it as an attack on their livelihood. Sugar duties were the first in the sequence of taxes that set 13 colonies arguing with the Crown. The Boston Tea Party was still 9 years away. The numbers of this system are known with unusual precision because the slave trade was conducted as ordinary business with paperwork, insurance, and accounts. On current estimates drawn from the database of transatlantic voyages, around 12.5 million people were shipped across the Atlantic. Roughly 10.7 million reached the other side. The difference, nearly 2 million human beings, is the people who died on the way. And more than 2/3 of everyone who did land went not to gold workings, not into houses as servants, and not, at first, to cotton fields. They went to sugar. That deserves saying plainly, because in most school teaching, slavery is filed under cotton. Cotton came later and was mostly concentrated in one country. The engine and the principal customer of the transatlantic slave trade for 2.5 centuries was sugar. And this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was arithmetic. It was reckoned cheaper to buy an adult, work them to the limit within a few years, and buy another, than to create conditions in which people lived into old age and raised children. On paper, the sums worked, which is precisely why the Caribbean colonies had almost no natural population growth and required a permanent supply. Now we come to the part where this story stops being about trade at all. It becomes about what happened inside the factory. An 18th century sugar plantation ran in 2 modes. For 8 or 9 months of the year, it was ordinary agricultural hard labor, planting cuttings, weeding, digging drainage trenches, clearing forest for new fields, dawn to dusk, 6 days a week. Then the harvest began, and the island shifted into a state that has no peacetime equivalent. Cane loses sugar by the hour once cut, so the mill cannot stop, so nothing else can stop either. In crop season, people worked shifts of 18 hours and more, sleeping in snatches beside the boiling house, and smoke stood over the estate for weeks. At the rollers, the woman feeding cane, beside her, the axe. In the boiling house, copper kettles of scalding syrup ladled from one to the next, And the burn from syrup is worse than boiling water because the thick mass doesn't run off. It sticks. Dutch, English, and French writers of the period described all this calmly in the tone of a technical manual. Mortality rose sharply in crop season. Rations were calculated at the minimum, often salt fish or salted meat shipped down from North America, plus root vegetables the enslaved were expected to grow themselves on an allotted patch in their own time, which is to say their rest was also spent producing their own food, and the whole thing was held together by direct violence. Punishments were public and routine, not because every overseer was a sadist, but because a few dozen white people were managing several hundred and sometimes several thousand enslaved people. A ratio like that can only be maintained by terror. We are not guessing about any of this, because some of the people who lived inside it wrote it down. Olata Equiano was taken as a child from what is now southeastern Nigeria in the 1750s, shipped through Barbados and Virginia, later worked for a merchant in the West Indies, and eventually bought his own freedom. In 1789, he published his life story in London, and it sold edition after edition. It did what no sympathetic outsider's pamphlet could. It put the reader in the hold and on the estate in the first person. Sugar had produced its own witness, and the witness could write. Here is the detail that explains everything that follows. Contrary to the sanitized picture, the ability to think, remember, and organize was never removed from these people. Escapes were constant. Independent communities of the formerly enslaved held territory in the Jamaican mountains and the Brazilian forests. Revolts broke out again and again. The system needed constant maintenance, not because it was stable, but because it was fragile. And one day, it broke. Saint-Domingue, the western third of Hispaniola, French. By the 1780s, it is the single most profitable place on the planet. Around 800 sugar plantations, 40% of the world's sugar, half the world's coffee, and cities with theaters and newspapers. The wealth of Bordeaux and Nantes is built on this one island, and on it, there are around 500,000 enslaved people to perhaps 30,000 whites. 15 to 1. The work is harder than on the English islands, mortality higher, the annual import of new people larger. The colony burns through its population and demands a top-up every year. In 1789, France has a revolution, and the language of the rights of man arrives in the Caribbean, the claim that people are born free and equal. The planters assumed this concerned them alone. On the night of the 22nd of August, 1791, the north of the colony rises. Plantations burn, the cane fields burn, and the glow is visible from ships far out at sea. Out of that rising comes a figure the whole world eventually knows: Toussaint Louverture. Born into slavery, freed before the Revolution, literate, self-taught in military theory from books, he becomes within a few years the man who defeats in turn the Spanish, the British, and the French, and who effectively governs the colony. Napoleon sends an army across the Atlantic to retake the island and restore slavery. Toussaint is seized by deception and shipped to France, where he dies in an Alpine fortress in 1803, in winter, in a cold cell of illness and neglect. He never saw how it ended. It ended in something unprecedented. The French army, having lost tens of thousands of men to fighting and yellow fever, withdrew. On the 1st of January, 1804, independence was declared, and Haiti appeared on the map, the first state ever created by enslaved people who freed themselves, and the second independent republic in the Americas. And here the story turns in the way that makes it worth telling in full. The freedom was never forgiven. Haiti was placed under a trade embargo. No power wanted to recognize a state whose example was lethal to their own colonies. In 1825, a French squadron anchored off the Haitian coast, and France offered a deal: recognition in exchange for compensation to the former slave owners for their lost property, including the people themselves. 150 million gold francs, later reduced to 90. To pay it, Haiti had to borrow from French and eventually American banks. The country serviced that debt for well over a century. The last payments on obligations grown from it were made in 1947. The only people in history who freed themselves were forced to buy their own freedom from the men who had held them, and to keep paying for 120 years. The sugar island that had been the richest place on earth became one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. That isn't a coincidence, and it isn't a curse. It's an invoice. While the Caribbean burned, something apparently peaceful was happening in Europe. People had started drinking tea with sugar in it. Tea, coffee, and chocolate all reach England within a few decades of each other in the 17th century, and all three are bitter. All three want sweetening. At first, the habit belongs to the rich. A cup of sweet tea is expensive and served as ritual. But as Caribbean output climbs, the price falls, and down the social ladder slides first the tea, then the sugar, then the whole ceremony. The numbers on that descent do the arguing. British sugar consumption rose 4 to 5-fold over the 18th century, and by the end of the 19th, the average person here was getting through some 90 pounds a year, close to a modern figure. From an apothecary's ounce to a spoonful in a laborer's mug in 200 years. And here sugar does the thing that makes it a historical force rather than a foodstuff. It becomes factory fuel. The 19th century British worker lives in a city, holds no land, has no time to cook, and works a 12 to 14-hour shift. Sweet tea with bread, hot, instant, delivering immediate energy and blunting hunger, turns out to be the ideal diet for that life. Cheap, no stove required, no time required, and it lifts you. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz, who wrote the best-known study of all this, called sugar the first genuinely mass consumer commodity of the modern world. Not a luxury that became affordable, but a product deliberately driven down in price until everybody bought it daily. And the two ends of that chain are wired together. For the worker in Manchester to have sweet tea, somebody across the Atlantic had to be standing at the kettles. Britain worked that out later than one would like, but it did work it out. In 1791, after Parliament threw out yet another bill against the slave trade, something new happened: a mass consumer boycott. People simply stopped buying West Indian sugar. Contemporary estimates put participation at around 300,000 households. Pamphlets did the arithmetic in the crudest possible terms, converting pounds of sugar into human lives. Grocers began advertising stock as the produce of free labor, which means ethical labeling on a food product was invented in the 1790s by shoppers boycotting sugar. Then the politics. In 1807, Britain abolishes the slave trade. In 1833, it passes the act ending slavery in most of its colonies. And here's the financial detail usually left out of the school version. Emancipation came with compensation, but it was not paid to the people who had been enslaved. It was paid to the owners, 20 million pounds, something like 40% of the national budget for the year. The government borrowed the money, and that loan was not finally cleared until 2015, which means that anyone who paid tax in Britain before 2015 was still, in a small way, servicing the compensation paid to slaveholders. Every recipient of that money is now listed, by name and by amount, and by the number of people they were paid for, in an open university database. It is genuinely worth searching. The names include ancestors of families, institutions, and fortunes still very much present. And sugar didn't disappear. Cane still had to be cut. Freed people left the plantations in large numbers because almost nobody wanted that work by choice. So the owners found a substitute, indentured laborers from India and to a lesser extent China. A 5-year contract, passage paid, wages close to nothing, and in practice, almost no way home. Between the 1830s and 1917, well over 1 million people were moved this way, which is why there are large Indian populations in Trinidad and Fiji today. Formally, free labor. In practice, the same plantation, the same cane, the same kettle, with a piece of paper attached. What eventually broke the plantation's monopoly was not mercy, it was botany. In 1747, a Berlin chemist, Andreas Marggraf, showed under a microscope that ordinary fodder beet contained the same crystals as cane. The finding was thought interesting and useless. The sugar content was far too low. His student, Franz Karl Achard, spent a career on the problem, selecting varieties and raising their yield, and in 1801 he opened the world's first beet sugar works in Silesia. Then politics intervened. Napoleon's continental blockade and the British Navy between them cut Europe off from colonial sugar, and the continent went without. In 1811, the emperor signed decrees committing thousands of hectares to beet, funding factories and founding schools for sugar technicians. An emergency measure grew into an industry. By the mid-19th century, beet supplied a serious share of world production, and by the early 20th, roughly half. The significance of that is bigger than economics. For 2 centuries, the planters' central argument had been, without the tropics and without forced labor, there is no sugar. Europe goes without, so keep your principles to yourself. Beet abolished that argument, physically. It turned out sugar grew in Silesia, in Bohemia, in France, and in Russia, in a field, on an ordinary farm. Alongside it, engineering made the product genuinely cheap. In 1813, the English chemist Edward Charles Howard patented the vacuum pan. At reduced pressure, syrup boils at a lower temperature, doesn't scorch, yields more, and burns less fuel. Then came steam mills, centrifuges, multiple effect evaporators. And then came the object now sitting in every cafe. Its origin is surprisingly domestic. In the Moravian town of Dačice in the 1840s, the manager of the local sugar works was Jakob Christoph Rad. Sugar still came as loaves, and at home you broke it up with iron nippers, awkward and dangerous. One day his wife Juliana cut her hand chipping a piece for tea. Rad built a mold in which syrup set into neat rectangles, and in 1843 he was granted a privilege for cube sugar. A household injury became the sugar cube, and the sugar cube went round the world. Follow that line. The apothecary's ounce, then the loaf under lock and key, then the sack in the grocer's, then the cube in a bowl. In a handful of generations, the substance that had moved millions of people across an ocean became so ordinary that it stopped registering as valuable at all. In Britain, the refining fortunes even redecorated the culture. Henry Tate, who made his money refining sugar in Liverpool and London, funded and stocked the gallery that still carries his name. Next time you walk into a Tate, you are walking through sugar money. But power over sugar hadn't vanished. It had merely changed hands, from kings and chartered companies to corporations. And the first demonstration happened in the middle of the Pacific. Sugar plantations are established in Hawaii from the 1830s. By the end of the century, the descendants of American missionaries and a handful of incoming businessmen control the land, the water, and the harbors. And the workforce is shipped in from Japan, China, the Philippines, and Portugal. Meanwhile, the islands are still an independent kingdom. The economy belongs to the planters. The country belongs to the crown. Arrangements like that don't hold. Queen Liliuokalani, who came to the throne in 1891, attempted to restore political weight to the monarchy and limit the influence of foreign landowners. In January 1893, a committee of businessmen and planters, backed by U.S. Marines, landed from a warship in the harbor, removed her from power. Within a few years, the islands were annexed by the United States. The kingdom was gone. The plantations remained. Sugar overthrew a monarchy, not metaphorically, and not in the Middle Ages, but at the end of the 19th century, in the age of the telegraph and the steamship. In the same decades, the American Sugar Trust assembled control of the overwhelming majority of U.S. refining and became one of the first defendants of the antitrust era. The structure that began with Crusaders in a Levantine valley had grown into a transnational corporation capable of rewriting laws and replacing governments. Cuba made the same point even more plainly. By the early 20th century, the island is the world's sugar bowl. Its mills and railways largely American-owned, its economy hanging on the quota Washington assigned it. Revolution comes in 1959. The quota is canceled, and the Soviet Union steps in to buy Cuban sugar above world prices, paying in oil. Notice what actually changed: the flag, the ideology, the patron, not the structure. One crop, one buyer. When that buyer vanished in 1991, the economy collapsed within months. A monoculture is always a contract with somebody else's fate, whoever holds the other end. Then sugar performed its last trick. It became invisible. 20th century production grew so large that price stopped being a constraint at all. So sugar was added not where you expect sweetness, but everywhere. Bread, sauces, cured meats, yogurt, packet soups, salad dressing, baby food. Not out of malice. Sugar is cheap, it extends shelf life, it improves texture, and it makes almost anything more appealing. A tablespoon of ketchup carries about a teaspoon of it. A can of soft drink can carry 10. It stopped being the thing you put in your cup and became the thing you eat without noticing. The 1970s added a second wave, an industrial process for high fructose corn syrup, perfected by Japanese researchers, handed American food manufacturers a sweetener cheaper than cane. And by the mid-'80s, the big drinks companies had switched. A third source, dependent on neither the tropics nor the beet field. Running alongside all of this was an argument about health, and one episode of it is worth close attention because it is documented. Through the 1960s, evidence linking sugar to heart disease was accumulating. The American Sugar Industries Trade Body commissioned a review of the scientific literature from researchers at Harvard. Internally, it was filed as Project 226. The review appeared in one of the most respected medical journals in the world in 1967, and it pointed confidently at fat and cholesterol as the dietary cause of heart disease, while presenting the evidence on sugar as weak. Readers were not told who had paid for it. Disclosure was not yet required. The internal documents were found and published in 2016 by the researcher Kristen Kearns and colleagues, and the correspondence shows the funding, the framing of the objective, and the review of drafts. The British physiologist John Yedkin, who spent those same years arguing that the real danger was sugar rather than fat, and who published a book with the unimprovable title Pure, White, and Deadly, was pushed to the margins of his profession and treated as a crank for the rest of his life. His rehabilitation was posthumous. The argument over exactly how much of which disease sugar is responsible for continues, and honestly, science does not hand us a simple answer. But there is an international recommendation. The World Health Organization advises keeping free sugars under 10% of daily energy, preferably under 5, around 25 grams. 6 teaspoons. A single can of soft drink covers the whole allowance with room to spare. Type 2 diabetes now affects more than 500 million adults worldwide, and sugar still carries a human cost that isn't metaphorical. A great deal of the world's cane is still cut by hand because hands remain cheaper than machines. In Central America, chronic kidney disease of unexplained origin has been recorded among cane cutters for decades, linked to work in extreme heat, dehydration, and sustained physical limits. Men die in their 30s and 40s in whole villages. Not in the 18th century. Now. Global trading sits with a handful of large firms. The biggest producers are Brazil and India, the two countries where this story began. And the policy response has been taxation. Mexico taxed sweetened drinks in 2014, the United Kingdom in 2018, dozens of countries since, provoking the same argument about freedom of choice as any other restriction. And Drax Hall on Barbados, where the English sugar revolution started, is still standing, still in the hands of descendants of that family. 400 years, and the line has not broken once. So here is what to take from all of it. We assume that historically important things look important: gold, oil, weapons, land. But the deepest marks are not left by rarities. They are left by habits. Gold changes owner. A habit changes the world. Sugar never conquered a continent by force. It simply became something that everybody wanted every single day. And that alone was enough to redraw the map of 3 continents, drive the largest forced migration in human history, invent the legal architecture of racial slavery, remove one kingdom, create one republic, and help pay for the Industrial Revolution. And the mechanism runs both ways. The same logic that made sugar a weapon made it ordinary. The moment it stopped being scarce, it stopped being power. Scarcity is what turns a commodity into authority. Not sweetness, not shine, not flavor. Only scarcity. Remember that the next time you stir a spoonful into a cup. Remember that 300 years ago, that spoonful cost a day's wages. Remember that people were carried across an ocean in a hold to make it, and that the bill for it was still being settled in the 20th century in Port-au-Prince and in the British national accounts. Remember that the axe by the mill hung there not because someone was a monster, but because it was efficient. And the next time you take a free packet of sugar off a cafe counter and tear it open without looking, hold your hand still for 1 second. You are holding something that once cost more than silver, was prescribed to kings, moved millions of human beings across an ocean, and brought down a state. It didn't become free because it got cheap on its own. It became free because it was already paid for, just not by us. If you made it this far, subscribe. That's how these stories reach anybody else. And tell me in the comments which part landed hardest. The axe by the rollers, the debt Haiti was still paying in 1947, or the compensation loan British taxpayers cleared in 2015. There are a lot more of these coming. Things you look at every day and never see.